I've always been the kind of person who dives headfirst into things. Whether it's a new hobby, a challenge, or an idea, I don't hesitate. Some might call it stubbornness. Others might say it's my need for independence. But I like to think of it as an adventurous spirit. There's something about the thrill of exploring the unknown, taking the road less traveled. It's the reason I found myself booking my first solo trip, even though I had no experience with it. It was something I'd wanted to do for a long time, and now was my chance. The destination, a small town that seemed quiet and quaint. The hostel I had chosen for my stay came highly recommended online. It was affordable, with excellent reviews, and most importantly, no staff after hours. Self-service only, which meant complete independence. I like that idea. No one checking up on you. No rules, no interruptions. Just me, my thoughts, and the town. It felt like the perfect place to start my solo travel journey. When I arrived, I was excited. The hostel had that old, charming vibe, creaky wooden floors, faded wallpaper, and a lingering smell of something I couldn't quite place. But it was all part of the experience, right? I shrugged it off. The place had character. It felt like stepping into a scene from an old movie, something romantic and adventurous. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. A strange, almost palpable sense of unease. The air was thick with it, and it clung to me like a heavy fog. The fluorescent lights above flickered as I made my way to the check-in area. The silence was deafening. There was no hum of background noise, no chatter, nothing. Just the eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of the building itself, as though the old place was breathing in and out. It felt alive, and not in a comforting way. But I brushed it off. I was just nervous. It was my first solo trip, after all. First night jitters, I told myself. I'd be fine. I dragged my suitcase down the dimly lit hallway and tried to ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. It was probably just the unfamiliarity of it all. That's when I saw him. A man was sitting on the couch in the common area. He looked to be in his mid-40s, shirtless, with a beer in one hand and a blank expression on his face. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his bloodshot eyes immediately met mine as I walked past. There was something about the way he looked at me, something unsettling. I nodded politely, a half-hearted gesture meant to acknowledge his presence and move past him. But instead of a casual acknowledgement or a polite nod in return, he just stared at me. His gaze was intense, almost too intense, like he was trying to peer right into me. The silence stretched between us, and I felt my throat tighten. The smell of alcohol wafted towards me, mixing with the strange, musty scent of the old hostel. He was drunk, I realized. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, but the word felt weak as soon as it left my lips. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe a grunt, maybe a slurred response, or perhaps nothing at all. But instead, he didn't say a word. He just kept staring at me, those bloodshot eyes never leaving mine. It was unnerving. The silence seemed to grow louder, suffocating. I was standing there, trapped in his gaze, wondering what to do. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke eye contact and quickly moved down the hallway to my room. The unease in my stomach hadn't subsided. In fact, it had only grown stronger. The room was small and dim, just as I had expected, but it was clean enough, and I felt a small sense of relief that it wasn't as bad as I feared. I threw my suitcase on the bed and tried to shake off the unsettling encounter. It was probably nothing, just a guy minding his own business. But the strange feeling stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts as I unpacked my things. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, the way they'd followed me, the emptiness in them. I told myself it was just nerves. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel his presence. It was as if the man's eyes were still on me, even though he was miles away. The night stretched on, the minutes crawling by. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the sense of dread. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the wind outside, seemed amplified in the silence of the hostel. But I fought the urge to get up and leave. I couldn't let myself be ruled by fear, not over something so small. The next morning, I was hoping that a fresh start would help clear my mind. But as I made my way to the common area for breakfast, I was greeted by the same sight. The man was still there, sitting on the couch, still shirtless, still staring at the space in front of him. But now, there was something different about his gaze, something darker. He didn't even look at me this time. He just kept staring into nothingness, lost in his own world. I wasn't the only one at the hostel now. A woman had checked in late last night, and I was relieved to see that she seemed about my age. She was from Sweden, and we exchanged brief pleasantries over coffee. I immediately felt a little better. Just having another person around made everything seem less eerie. But as we spoke, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The man, who had been sitting still when I first entered, was now watching us. His eyes weren't just glancing in our direction, they were fixed on us. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and unnerving, like a weight on my shoulders. Anna, the woman from Sweden, didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. She kept talking to me, and I forced myself to focus on her words, trying to ignore the man in the corner. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His stare was unyielding, almost like he was waiting for something. I wasn't sure what, but the feeling was growing stronger by the minute. My heart started to race, and I found myself becoming more and more aware of the room around me, the creaking of the building, the flickering of the lights, the faint hum of an old radiator. Everything felt so off. I excused myself from Anna's conversation, pretending I needed to check on something in my room. I wasn't sure why I needed an excuse. I just had to get away from the man. His presence was too much, too oppressive. I could feel my hands trembling as I grabbed my coffee cup and hastily made my way back to my room. But the man's eyes never left me. As I reached the hallway, I glanced back over my shoulder and saw him still staring. It was like he could see straight through me, and the intensity of it made my stomach churn. I locked the door behind me and sat on the bed, trying to calm myself down. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, but I didn't dare open the door to look. Every instinct in me was telling me to stay put, to avoid any further interaction with the man. But the silence in the room was maddening, and my thoughts kept racing. Why did I feel so terrified? What was it about him that unsettled me so much? Hours passed before I mustered the courage to leave my room. By then, it was nearing dusk, and the light outside had begun to dim. I was determined to make the best of my trip, to not let one unsettling encounter ruin everything. I grabbed my coat and decided to take a walk around the town. The fresh air would clear my mind, I thought. But as soon as I stepped outside, I saw him again. The man was standing at the entrance of the hostel, as if he had been waiting for me. His pale skin seemed even more ghostly in the fading light, and his eyes, those bloodshot, soulless eyes, locked onto mine the moment I stepped into view. I froze, feeling the blood drain from my face. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me like a predator. My breath hitched, and I could feel my chest tightening. This wasn't normal. Something was very wrong. I turned quickly, desperate to get away, and walked as fast as I could down the street. But no matter how far I went, I could still feel his gaze on me. as though it was following me, burning into the back of my skull. I glanced over my shoulder, but he wasn't there. He hadn't followed me. Still, the feeling didn't go away. It was as if he was always near, always watching, even when I couldn't see him. I returned to the hostel, not daring to go back inside right away. I sat on a bench outside, trying to steady my breathing. What was going on? I had no answers. All I knew was that I was scared, and I didn't know why. Later that night, I gathered enough courage to go back inside. The hostel seemed quieter than ever. The man was gone, his absence was almost a relief, but it also made everything feel colder, emptier. I made my way to my room and locked the door behind me once again. But as I lay in bed, drifting off to sleep, I heard something. A soft, almost inaudible sound at first, a faint rustling, a creak, a whisper. My heart pounded, and I shot upright in bed, my senses on high alert. Was it him? Had he come back? The sounds grew louder, more distinct. Then, I heard something else, something chilling. A voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Come out and play. The words sent a chill down my spine. I held my breath, trying to gather my thoughts. Was it a prank? Maybe it was just the wind, the building settling. But the words repeated, louder this time. Come out and play if you dare. I didn't dare. I couldn't. But it was impossible to ignore him. His presence was suffocating, like a shadow that followed us wherever we went. He didn't speak, didn't make a move, he just watched. Every time I turned, I felt his eyes on me, studying me from the corner of my vision. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled with the intensity of his stare, but I tried to tell myself that I was being paranoid. People are strange sometimes, especially in hostels. The first day had felt innocent enough. Anna and I had arrived at the hostel, looking for a quiet, affordable place to stay for a few days. We were backpackers, tired after a long journey, and we wanted nothing more than to rest before heading out again. But from the moment we stepped through the door, something felt off. The reception was cold, the lights flickering, and the walls seemed to hold their breath, as if they were waiting for something or someone to happen. The man had been sitting in the common room when we checked in, his face obscured by a hood, his posture stiff, as though he was trying to make himself invisible. We thought little of it at first. Hostels were filled with all sorts of people. Some just wanted to be left alone. Others were eager to strike up a conversation. It was the usual mix of travelers, and the man seemed no different. At least, that's what we told ourselves. But as the hours passed, I began to feel a growing unease. It wasn't just his stillness, it was his silence. People came and went, laughing, chatting, or getting lost in their phones. But this man said nothing. He barely moved. His presence was like a weight in the room, an invisible pressure that pressed against my chest. Anna seemed unaffected, as usual, chatting away with other guests, while I withdrew, trying to focus on the book I was reading. But even the words on the page couldn't hold my attention. My mind kept drifting back to him. Every time I glanced up, I found him staring at me, his eyes sharp and unsettling, like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the first move. As the day wore on, the place grew quieter. Most of the guests had gone out to explore, and Anna turned in early, claiming she was tired. I found myself alone in the common area, sitting at one of the old wooden tables, trying to distract myself with work on my laptop. But no matter how hard I focused, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the air thick with tension. There was a low hum of discomfort that seemed to pulse beneath everything, like the faintest vibration of a tuning fork that resonated deep in my bones. My hands were clammy as I typed, my fingers stumbling on the keyboard as the sensation of being watched intensified. The room felt colder than it should have been, the dim lighting casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and move. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that doesn't come naturally, the kind that feels forced, as though someone was trying to keep their breath from being heard. And then, he approached me. I didn't hear him at first. The footsteps were soft, too soft, but when I finally noticed him, he was standing right next to me. He had appeared out of nowhere, like a ghost materializing from the shadows. He was holding out his phone, the cracked screen reflecting the dim light, the text barely readable. His breath hit me first, a foul, sour smell of alcohol mixed with something rancid. The stench made my stomach turn, and I fought the urge to recoil. His clothes were unkempt, his eyes glassy and unfocused. I tried not to meet his gaze, but it was impossible. His eyes were fixed on me, locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt trapped. "Come downstairs, away from Anna." The words on his phone were poorly translated, and the broken English only made it harder to understand what he was asking. My mind raced, panic setting in, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, to calm myself. I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I couldn't afford to provoke him. My heart pounded in my chest as I asked, my voice trembling, "What do you want?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he mumbled something else. The words slurred, his speech disjointed. "Just talk," he said, his voice barely audible, but the desperation in it was unmistakable. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, his eyes never leaving mine. It felt as though he was assessing me, waiting for something. But what? I couldn't be sure. Something about the way he stood there, unmoving, made my skin crawl. I knew I couldn't stay here, not with him so close. But I didn't want to escalate things. So, with my heart hammering in my chest, I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll come." Without another word, I followed him. My footsteps were hesitant, reluctant, each one dragging like an anchor tied to my feet. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended into the hostel's darkened lower level. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally, swallowing up the faint light from the bulbs overhead. When we reached the bottom, I could see that the common area was completely empty. The usual chatter was gone. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the dark. The dim lighting cast long, eerie shadows on the cracked walls. The place felt abandoned, almost as though it had been forgotten by time itself. He motioned for me to sit, but I didn't. I stood stiffly, my back pressed against the wall, my hands shaking at my sides. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, to get away from him, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, frozen in place by fear. He started talking about the internet, something about how he wanted me to improve the connection, make it faster, for my work. But the words didn't make sense. None of it did. The way he glanced over his shoulder toward the stairs, the way he kept glancing back at me, it was like he was waiting for something. I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped. "Cut the crap," I said, my voice sharp, breaking the heavy silence that hung in the air. "What do you really want?" For a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes flickering with confusion. Then, like a switch flipping, he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I want you to stay downstairs, away from Anna. She's up there, and I need to be alone with her." The words hit me like a slap to the face, and my stomach twisted in knots. Panic surged through me, raw and intense. But I didn't speak. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. I turned and fled. The stairs felt endless as I ran back up, my footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the hostel. When I reached the top, I slammed into the door to Anna's room, pounding my fists against it with desperate urgency. "Anna, wake up!" I shouted, my voice breaking with fear. My heart was in my throat, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Anna appeared, her eyes half closed with sleep. But when she saw the fear on my face, she knew something was wrong. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. Without a word, I grabbed her by the wrist and yanked her inside the room, locking the door behind us. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, and I could hear the man's footsteps downstairs, slow and deliberate. He was waiting, watching. For hours, we stayed there, locked in that room, listening to every sound, every creak of the floorboards beneath us. The night stretched on, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I couldn't sleep, couldn't calm my breathing. Every whisper of wind outside felt like a warning. Every sound from the hall sent my heart racing. Finally, just as dawn began to break, there was a knock on the door. It was the hostel manager. I had almost forgotten about him. He had been absent the entire night, leaving us alone with whatever had been lurking in the dark. When he arrived, the man was gone. But the fear didn't leave. It lingered in the corners of the room, in the silence that followed. I didn't want to look for answers. Some things were better left unexplored. I checked out that morning, leaving without a word to anyone. The journey back to the city was long, the hours dragging by, but they were nothing compared to the weight I had carried the night before. I didn't tell anyone what had happened in that hostel. I couldn't. It was too strange, too unsettling. The memory of those hours still haunts me. I can still feel the cold air, still hear the sound of footsteps in the dark. I'll never forget what it was like to be alone with the darkness and the man who lurked within it.